I think we'll begin. There are some stragglers who will straggle, but I just want to thank Dr. Wollenberg for teaching this lecture. We are really fortunate at Anshe Shalom to have a very learned and talented congregation, and they share of their knowledge with us. So thank you, David, for teaching tonight. We're looking forward to learning with you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it. I'm David Wollenberg. I think I know most of you. We're here tonight to talk about this guy right here, Benedict Spinoza, born Baruch Spinoza in Amsterdam, 1632. He probably looked a little more like this, to be honest with you, but he tends to be depicted like this, slightly more noble, maybe more goyish as well. Who is Spinoza? Depends on who you ask. He's been called a man drunk on God. He's also been called a vicious atheist. He's sometimes called a saint, sometimes a Machiavellian. Some have called him a rationalist, others have called him a mystic. Some have said he's the last medieval philosopher, others have said he's the first modern philosopher. Some say he's the founder of liberal democracy, others say that he's a Marxist avant la lettre, others say that he's a libertarian. So it really depends on who you ask, so we'll spend this hour getting to know him a little bit more. I'll try to summarize his thought right now in sort of three main points. One, he was the first philosopher, first modern philosopher, to say in his own name that we need to understand nature and the universe in purely naturalistic terms. No opportunity for divine intervention, no supernatural. Everything can be understood in terms of naturalistic cause and effect. That's one. Number two, a little bit of an outgrowth of that one, he was the first person really to say that the Bible is a book like any other book. It needs to be understood just like you understand any text, understand its authors, who they were in history, their use of language. That's how you understand the Bible. Nothing divine about it. And then third, he was really the first person to argue for liberal democracy and free speech. So really tremendous impact across both theoretical philosophy as well as theology and politics. My agenda for the next hour, I'll talk about his biography for about 10-15 minutes, then try to get into his thought for maybe 20-30 minutes, and then finally talk about his impact and influence. I'll give the caveat up front that I spent many years studying Spinoza in a very academic environment, so feel free to interrupt me anytime with questions or anything, comments. Really appreciate it. So let's get started. Okay, Spinoza was born 1632 in Amsterdam. He's born into a Portuguese family. A lot of Portuguese and Spanish Jews came to the Netherlands following the Inquisition, or during the Inquisition. And Amsterdam was a very interesting community, both Jewish and non-Jewish. It really had a big mix of Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews. A lot of the rabbis were Italian. The Sephardi and Ashkenazi lived side by side. The Jewish quarter was not that big, but they tended to be fairly independent of one another. It was a very cosmopolitan city, probably the most cosmopolitan city in Europe. You had a lot of tolerance, more than you'd find elsewhere. This is a time in history when Jews weren't even allowed in Britain. They weren't allowed in Spain or Portugal either. Amsterdam, very tolerant of Jews, as well as many Christian sects as well, Anabaptists, Socinians, other sort of radical sects. So he was very fortunate to have been born there. He probably could not have had the career he had anywhere else. There were really two main political camps in Amsterdam in that day. There was a monarchic camp that was sort of allied with the lower classes, and then there was also some more commercial middle class, and there's kind of an uneasy tension between those two. Most Jews tended to side with the monarchic camp, but that's thankfully both were pretty tolerant of Jews at that period. Like I said, there were a lot of different backgrounds. We actually don't know Spinoza's first language, as odd as that sounds. It may have been Dutch, it may have been some kind of blend of Spanish with Hebrew, like a Ladino type of language. It may have just been Hebrew, or maybe even Portuguese. So we're not quite sure. He probably spoke a little bit of all those languages. He was born, like I said, in this very Jewish community. He got a traditional education. He went to Jewish school. There were a few rabbis there, the most famous of which was a guy named Manasseh ben Israel. He's best known for going to England to try and make the case to let Jews back into England, and was successful at that. He received that Jewish education until around age 13 or so, when both of his parents died. His mother died at a young age, and then his father died around age 13. So he ended his education and started working around then. His brother, Michael Spinoza, and he started a shipping business, and they were traders for a number of years. It seemed like they were moderately successful. There's some evidence to suggest he continued Jewish education in the evenings, went to events just like this one, learning Jewish texts. Certainly, if he wasn't going to synagogue, he was continuing to learn on his own. He definitely was very knowledgeable, which I'll get to in a little bit. But then 1656 comes to the monumental event in his life. He is 24 years old, and he is excommunicated from Judaism. We don't actually know exactly why he was excommunicated. This is before he wrote any of his books. That certainly was not the issue. But some of the ideas that were in these books were probably in some kind of early embryonic form, and he was sharing them, and it was enough to get kicked out of the community. I should give the caveat that excommunication or herem was more commonly used in those days than it would be today. People could get excommunicated for not paying their shul dues, so maybe something to keep in mind if you're but typically speaking, most Jews came back and were able to come back. Spinoza never did. I included number 1 here in our text sheet, the herem that we have against him, so I'll read this. So, the seigneurs of the Mahmad make it known that they have long since been cognizant of the wrong opinions and behavior of Baruch de Spinoza, and tried various means and promises to dissuade him from his evil ways, but as they effected no improvement, obtaining on the contrary more information every day of the horrible heresies which he practiced and taught, and of the monstrous actions which he performed, they decided that the same as Spinoza should be excommunicated. The Lord will not pardon him. The anger and wrath of the Lord will rage against this man and bring upon him all the curses which are written in the book of the law, and the Lord will destroy his name from under the heavens, and the Lord will separate him to his injury from all the tribes of Israel, with all the curses of the firmament which are written in the book of the law. You who will cleave unto the Lord God are all alive this day. We order that nobody should communicate with him orally or in writing, show him any favor, or stay with him under the same roof, or within 4 amot of him, or read anything composed or written by him. So this is a more strident text than other excommunications of the day. We have other ones which are much more mild. This one was definitely far stronger in its use of language. So he was definitely sharing some opinions that the rabbis were not so happy about. Ironically, when he's excommunicated is exactly when the Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel is in England arguing for tolerance of the Jews in England. So while he's arguing for tolerance, the Jews at home were kicking Spinoza out. He never returned. He never came back to Judaism, and as far as we can tell, had never had any interest in coming back to Judaism. He lived in a very unique state for his day, a man without a religion, or without a church. Probably in any other country this would not have been tolerated, but he was sort of a unique figure and sort of became known as this apostate Jew who was living on his own and eventually spreading some radical philosophy. He became something of a curiosity, you might say. He could no longer play a part in his brother's business or do any kind of commerce with the Jewish community, so he started a new business as a lens grinder, which is the person who takes sheets of glass and makes them into lenses that are used in people's eyeglasses as well as telescopes and microscopes as well. He developed a pretty positive reputation as a lens grinder. There was a contemporary of his named Christian Huygens who discovered the rings of Saturn, and this guy Huygens thought that Spinoza's lenses were the best lenses that one could acquire. I don't know if Spinoza's lenses were used to discover the rings of Saturn, but by the same guy. He became something of a public intellectual. After leaving the Jewish community, he became involved with intellectual circles. He learned Latin. He participated in debates of the day. The biggest philosopher of the time was a guy named René Descartes. Descartes was French by birth, but he lived his last 20 years of his life in the Netherlands. So Descartes' philosophy was widely discussed. Spinoza did the most Jewish thing he could do, which is to write a commentary on Descartes' book, The Principles of Philosophy. So Descartes, he wrote in a very free-flowing, almost stream of consciousness style. One of his famous books is called Meditations, and it's really just like an armchair, sort of free-form thinking. Spinoza was a very rigorous thinker and didn't like that manner of thinking, like that manner of philosophizing. So he basically rewrote Descartes' philosophy in a geometric manner, where he took a definition and proposition and backed it up with argument, and really tried to present Descartes' philosophy in a very rigorous way, staying as close to Descartes as he could, and then after that providing commentary and criticism of what Descartes had to say. The book was actually pretty well received, and it made Spinoza a little bit famous, probably not rich, but a little bit famous as a philosopher, and he's offered a job at the University of Heidelberg to be a professor there, professor of philosophy. He turns it down, I think because he knew, then as now, universities are tolerant as long as you express opinions that conform with what the others around you, and he decided he didn't want to take that risk. And so he stayed in the Netherlands as a private intellectual doing his lens grinding. He's known to have lived a very aesthetic life. He didn't have a lot of money. He's partially supported by his friends, but he did not live a hermetic life. He maintained a pretty active correspondence. He was in touch with many famous people, not only that astronomer I mentioned, Huygens, but also another famous philosopher named Leibniz, as well as a guy named Henry Oldenburg, who was the secretary of the Royal Academy in Britain. So Oldenburg was in some ways one of the key intellectual nexus points of modern science. People who wanted to have their new discoveries published in the proceedings of the Royal Society would write to Oldenburg, and then Spinoza corresponded with him, and via Oldenburg learned a lot about the science of his day, and we have letters still. They talk about the possibility of a vacuum and others of innovative scientific ideas of these days. He never, as far as we know, corresponded with Thomas Hobbes, another philosopher who was contemporary with, but they both read each other's work and commented on each other's work. He also had a lot of interaction and correspondence with not famous people, intellectuals or people of his day. And I included one in our source sheet by a guy who's not famous at all, but I thought it was an interesting correspondence, so I'll read it to give you a taste of what intellectual life was like in the mid-1600s. The letter from Hugo Buxo. Distinguished Sir, my reason for writing to you is this. I want to know your opinion about apparitions and ghosts or specters. If you admit their existence, what do you think about them? How long does their life last? Some hold them to be mortal, others immortal. As I am doubtful whether you admit their existence, I'll proceed no further. Meanwhile, it's certain that the ancients believed in them. The theologians and philosophers of today are hitherto agreed as to the existence of some creatures of the kind. Though they may not agree as to the nature of their essence. Some assert they are composed of very thin and subtle matter, others that they are spiritual. But as I was saying before, we're quite at cross purposes, inasmuch as I am doubtful whether you'd grant their existence. Though, as you must be aware, so many instances and stories of them are found throughout antiquity, it'd really be difficult to either deny them or doubt them. It's easy to laugh at a guy like this and think that he's a superstitious guy or not an educated guy, but actually for the day, that was accepted belief. People could believe in ghosts, and people would read contemporary theology or philosophy and believe in things that we would think are absurd. And that's what makes, in my opinion, the 16th century, or the 17th century, 1600s, quite interesting. That modern science is being revolutionized so quickly that people are losing touch with what's true and with what's not true, and things that have been accepted by educated people for thousands of years are being swept by the wayside, and people no longer really know what's true and what's not. So I'll give Spinoza's response. Let us defer the question whether ghosts are delusions and imaginary, for as I see that not only denial of them, but even doubt about them seems very singular to you, as to one who has been convinced by the numerous histories related by men of today and the ancients, the great esteem and honor in which I have always held and still hold you does not suffice me to contradict you, so as to humor you. Pray tell me, my dear sir, before I explain myself further in the matter, what are these ghosts or specters? Are they children or fools or madmen? For all that I have heard of them seems more adapted to the silly than the wise, or to say the best we can of it resemble the pastimes of children or fools. Before I end, I'd submit to you one consideration, namely that the desire which most men have to narrate things, not as they really happen, but as they wish them to happen, can be illustrated in the stories of ghosts and specters more easily than any others. The principal reason for this, I believe, is that stories are only attested by the narrators, and thus a fabricator can add or suppress circumstances it seems most convenient to him without fear of anyone being able to contradict. And I highlighted the one sentence in particular, as we'll get to in a little bit. Desire is a major part of Spinoza's philosophy, and he sees our actions and beliefs as primarily driven by desire. He, in addition to corresponding with, yeah, please.
Did he study philosophy from any everybody, or did he have access to?
Yeah, so he studied Descartes very deeply during these years. Descartes was the biggest name of the day, I would say. He was maybe about 20 years. He died right around when Spinoza was born. So by the time Spinoza was reading him, Descartes dead about 20 years. But the philosophy is still very much alive. I think Spinoza probably read some of the ancients. He learned Latin, probably not Greek, but he definitely read Aristotle and Plato, as well as some of the atomist philosophers. He has really no respect for the ancient philosophers at all. I mean, he's living in this time of enlightenment when science is sort of sweeping away ancient science, and we're learning everything new using modern principles of method. And I think he felt philosophy, and back in those days, philosophy and science were not considered two different disciplines. They were sort of considered one discipline. And so he thought, okay, just like we're developing a new science, we're developing a new philosophy now as well. So in addition to talking with intellectuals, he's also close to the civil leaders of Amsterdam. There are two in particular, these brothers named the De Witt brothers. One of them was the mayor of Amsterdam, and another was a prominent politician as well. Spinoza was very close to them, and there's some evidence that they may have even given him financial support. At one point, however, the political winds, you might say, shifted in Amsterdam, and there was a little bit of a uprising, and these two brothers were killed by mob violence. And it was very upsetting to Spinoza. He definitely led him, probably furthered him in the belief that there is a gulf, you might say, between a philosophic few and a many who are driven by passions and who are irredeemable, which sort of the belief has stuck with him for many years. Most of the writings he was doing at this time were sort of abstract philosophy. After that incident where these two brothers were killed, he turned his sights to some more practical matters to try and sort of tame the passions, you say. That's what led him to write this book, probably the most famous book of his day, the Theological Political Treatise. Hopefully I'll be able to get a little bit more into the content of it later. But in short, he argued that traditional religious concepts were impossible. There was no possibility of miracles, of revelation, of prophecy. The Bible is a work like any other book. It's written by people. He claimed that there's no moral limits to sovereign power. People could do whatever they wanted. There was no sense of good or evil. But practically speaking, democracy and civil liberties were more sensible than a monarchy or a despotism. He wrote the book anonymously, but people figured out pretty quickly who wrote it. And as you might guess, it wasn't really well received. It's hard to know quite what Spinoza imagined he would accomplish by this book. But it was solidly condemned. One reviewer called it a book forged in hell by the apostate Jew working together with the devil. That's probably a common sentiment. And within a year, it was banned from Amsterdam. He became even more isolated. People knew who he was. He moved a couple times, eventually moving to The Hague. In the last few years of his life, he writes a number of books, including a second political treatise where he leaves out the theological elements and just focuses on politics. He writes a book on Hebrew grammar intended to teach non-Jews how to read the Bible properly. And he has sort of this philosophic view of grammar where he sees Hebrew, he sees a very noun-centric language, somehow reflecting the Jewish beliefs, and a more verb-centric language would be more about dynamic becoming rather than a kind of stasis he sees in theology. It's a little bit out there. And then he wrote his magnum opus, The Ethics, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. None of these later books are published in his lifetime, but he passes away at 1677 at age 45 from tuberculosis. So his intellectual career is only about 20 years long. Everything he did that he's remembered for intellectually is only about 20 years. His friends quickly gathered all his materials together and published it as one collected works. They couldn't really publish it under his name, so they published it anonymously. And it was often sold with fake covers. And the cover of the book would claim to be something different. And if you knew where to go, and you'd ask the bookseller, and he would sell it to you, and Spinoza's book would be inside. So it was passed down in sort of this hidden form. For about 100 years after his death, the name Spinoza is considered synonymous with atheism and really evil. I mean, I think to imagine being called a Spinozist, a follower of Spinoza, you have to sort of imagine like maybe being called a communist in 1950s America. Like it's a really bad term to call someone, and no one wanted to be called a Spinozist. About 100 years later, though, there's the Enlightenment has progressed a little bit, and there's kind of a rediscovery of Spinoza, both politically and philosophically. So philosophically, men like Kant, Hegel, eventually Marx and Nietzsche, are engaging with Spinoza's philosophy. Politically, he has a lot of influence on democratic thinkers, including in this country. So Jefferson owned 3 copies of this book. It was also owned by Madison, by Franklin. Reason to believe that it influenced them as they were having the debates in this country. In the 20th century, we have sort of a divergence of philosophy into what's sometimes considered an Anglo-American school, as well as a European continental philosophy school. And Spinoza is one of the few thinkers who sort of crosses that divide. Bertrand Russell, a very mathematically driven rational philosopher, called Spinoza the most unlovable of all philosophers. And one of the most prominent European philosophers, a guy named Gilles Deleuze, about as far from Bertrand Russell as you can get, very abstract, inaccessible French philosopher, referred to Spinoza as the prince of philosophers. And among Marxist thinkers, Louis Althusser was a big Spinoza fan, and as a result, Spinoza's thought has had a lot of influence on contemporary Marxist thought as well. He's had a lot of resurgence in the past 2 centuries as well, and I think among Jewish circles, he's more welcome and more read than he would have been at any time in the past. So I'm going to take a breath there, see if there's any questions about his life, his thought. Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit more what parts of his thinking influenced early American thinkers like Jefferson and Madison, as you mentioned?
Mm-hmm. So he's running at the same time as Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes is a monarchist thinker and makes a strong case for the absolute right of kings. Spinoza, on the other hand, is a pro-democrat, pro-democracy, pro-free speech thinker. He makes his arguments really on pragmatic terms, not in the sense of like natural rights, which is at least what it would seem to be in the Declaration of Independence, for example. So Locke, who followed Spinoza by about 20 or 30 years, is a much more politic writer. He does not attack the Bible. He, in fact, often invokes the Bible. And so someone like Locke or Montesquieu is much more acceptable for a person like Jefferson or Madison to quote. No one, even in the late 1700s, is going to quote Spinoza by name. But his arguments for free speech and democracy and why it's superior from a pragmatic point of view, I think was appealing to some people who maybe were on the fence about natural right doctrine, which today we take for granted, but was a more radical idea back in the day, especially after the French Revolution, because the French Revolution uses natural right doctrine to justify, ultimately, a lot of violence. Mm-hmm. And so maybe as that fades away as a acceptable grounding of democracy, a more pragmatic argument becomes more tolerable. Okay. So, not too far behind schedule. Mm-hmm. All right, so the ethics. A short book, but a very dense book. It's written like a mathematical proof. It's got definitions, postulates, propositions. He'll make a claim, then he'll back it up, and then future propositions are then based off of that, and it's sort of built up in this geometric structure. So he's trying to develop rigor similar to mathematics, similar to Euclid in his form of philosophy. So it's an intimidating book. It's not a book that you can pick up casually and just pleasure read it. You're sort of constantly like flipping back and forth to see how previous arguments back up current arguments. It's called the Ethics. It has nothing to do with ethics as we would understand that term. And we typically think of ethics as something similar to morality. There's absolutely none of that in this book. And in fact, he argues against the possibility of any kind of morality by nature. What the book is about is a rather ambitious book. It tries to explain nature and the universe, the human mind, and our ability to understand the universe, what drives human behavior, and how ultimately we can use that knowledge of both the universe as a whole and the human mind and human behavior, the human body, to overcome our passions and achieve true knowledge, which is the highest good for Spinoza. The core principle for Spinoza is a naturalistic view of the universe, which is driven purely by cause and effect. Everything that is in nature can be explained in purely naturalistic terms by causes that a person could, at least in theory, figure out with the right experimentation. So it's what we might call today a disenchanted version of nature. There's no possibility for intervention by a divine being, or even the existence of a divine being. There's no supernatural of any kind. The interesting thing about Spinoza is that he takes this radically de-theologized version of nature and he labels that God. And so there's a famous phrase, God or nature, which isn't an either or, it's sort of like God, i.e. nature. So how does Spinoza sort of say that with a straight face? So the universe, his universe, it's infinite in dimension, it's infinite in power, so you might say it's omnipotent, just like God as we understand it. The universe contains everything that is the case. It contains, it is all truth, so you might say the mind of God, if you will, is omniscient. The mind of God, all facts of the universe are part of God, just like we would say, and of course it's omnipresent. So in that way it matches the traditional conception of God. There are, of course, some key differences here. So a traditional conception of God, to use a traditional language here, would be that God's intellect and God's will are distinct things, meaning God can know what's happening in the universe and things can happen against God's will, and we have free action. For Spinoza, God's intellect and will are the same thing, meaning there's nothing that could be true that isn't the result of God. God is not, to be clear, is not an actor, of course, but there's nothing that can happen that's in any sense imperfect, incomplete, or deficient. The universe is what it is, and it could not be any other way. And of course, traditionally theologically we view the universe as something that has a purpose, that was created with an end in mind in some way, and Spinoza would say absolutely not. Everything happened because of a cause, but that cause had no end, no teleology of where the universe is going. Everything follows strict laws. Now, when Spinoza calls this God, he is not advocating some kind of mystical pantheism. He's not saying we should worship this thing. He's not saying it's divine or holy in any sense. Why he decides to use the term God is a complicated question. I think in part it's to protect himself from charges of atheism, because he can then say, how can you call me atheist? I talk about God in every page of my book. But also in part it's because both with God as well as many of the doctrines of religion, I think he genuinely believes that traditional notions are, in some sense, as if through a cloud, true. People had some basic idea of what the truth was, but it became distorted, and they had a faulty view. And he wants to, rather than reject that view in a very negative way, he wants to sort of embrace certain elements of it and sort of bring to light what he sees as true in it, rather than sort of take this more militant atheism that we'd see today. Not that he could have gotten away with it, but I think even if he could have gotten away with it, he didn't think that was a useful way of arguing. So nature follows mechanical necessity. And if you look at quote 3 here, I think this is a pretty representative quote of his view of nature. So keep in mind what he means by God. Things could have been produced by God in no other way, and in no other order than they've been produced. For all things have necessarily followed from God's given nature, and have been determined from the necessity of God's nature to exist and produce an effect in a certain way. Therefore, if things could have been of another nature, or could have been determined to produce an effect in another way, so that the order of nature was different, then God's nature could also have been other than it is now, which is absurd. Things have been produced by God with the highest perfection, since they have followed necessarily from a given most perfect nature. Nor does this convict God of any imperfection, for his perfection compels us to affirm this. Since in eternity there is neither when nor before nor after, it follows from God's perfection alone that he can never decree anything different and never could have. I have taken out both from this text as well as, of course, previous to this parts of the argument that lead him to this conclusion. But you can sort of get a taste here that even though he's not arguing from religious bases, he uses that religious language in a way to try and make people who argue against him into the anti-God side, he might say. He might say, if you're arguing against me, then you're claiming that God's imperfect. So really, you're the atheist, or you're the person who should be condemned, not me. Which is an interesting rhetorical technique. So there's no alternative to how nature is, how the universe is, and that includes, of course, human will. There's no freedom of will for human beings. We're as thoroughly determined as all objects in nature. Similarly, there's no sense of good or evil, no moral laws by nature. There's no notion of beauty. These are simply human evaluations. They have no philosophic meaning. But if Spinoza sounds like a relativist, that's true in these terms, but it's not true when it comes to truth. He does think that truth is something that is objective, and that the human mind is capable of knowing the truth. And in his bold claim, he says that the human mind can have a completely true understanding of God's infinite essence, meaning that there's nothing about nature which is in any sense at its core mysterious or unknowable. Like, to be is to be understandable by the human mind. It doesn't mean that we all know everything, not by any means, but there's nothing that we couldn't know. Yeah.
Why does he think that to be understandable is synonymous with be understandable by the human mind?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's a good question, and I think it's a challengeable point in Spinoza's philosophy. But he does have this conviction that the mind as a moment or an expression of God is, in some sense, our thinking is in some sense in harmony with the logic of nature itself. So nature follows a kind of logic, the logic of cause and effect, and our brain, our mind, is capable of understanding that logic. Because I guess just as our bodies follow those laws, and everything we know follow those laws, there's nothing that doesn't, nothing that we couldn't know. But I think it's definitely a place where one could argue with Spinoza, and nowadays I think many people would. So this notion of causality might sound very passive in terms of human behavior. It might sound like our entire life is very reactionary. We're purely a result of the causes that have impacted us up to this point, and of the nature of our body. It would sound like really there's no purpose. It can almost sound pointless in a way, but Spinoza does not believe that, even though he believes in this idea that we're purely caused and purely determined. There is a possibility of meaning in human life, and of a better life and a worse life. It's just that we have to understand that, understand our lives in a purely naturalistic framework, rather than try and ground it in myths or superstitions. So human behavior, human nature, is composed of what Spinoza calls affects. Affects, sort of a rough synonym for emotions or dispositions. It's a combination of sort of who we are, our body, our nature, as well as how we've interacted with the things that are around us. The interplay of those two things is complicated, but it's a composition, you might say, of who we are and our world. If we look at note 4 here, quote 4, you can see a sense of how he understands human nature and these affects, and how he wants to study them. Now I wish to return to those who prefer to curse or laugh at the affects and actions of men rather than understand them. The way of understanding the nature of anything of whatever kind must also be the same, namely through the universal laws and rules of nature. The affects of hate, anger, envy, etc. follow from the same necessity and force of nature as other singular things, and therefore they have certain causes through which they are understood and have certain properties as worthy of our knowledge as the properties of any other thing. Therefore, I shall treat the nature and powers of the affects and the power of the mind over them by the same method by which in the preceding parts I treated God in the mind, and I shall consider human actions and appetites to consider a question of lines, planes, and bodies. In another text, he makes a similar comparison, and he compares studying human beings to studying lightning or thunderstorms. And so the point is, there's nothing especially unique, nothing qualitatively unique about human life. Maybe we're more complex than a rock, but it's ultimately the same underlying laws. And Spinoza doesn't want to condemn human behavior. He's not here to judge it, per se. He's here to try and understand what it is, and you have to understand it in these naturalistic terms. All bodies, all things in nature, Spinoza believes, and this is something he doesn't do a good job of defending, but it's a core belief of his, that what defines anything is a striving towards self-preservation. By virtue of being a thing, that thing wants to preserve itself in nature. And it doesn't matter whether you're a book or a stand or a person. It's not a psychological principle. It's an argument about what nature is. However, it manifests itself in human psychology, in certain actions, certain traits. And it manifests especially in the form of desire. Desire is what Spinoza believes is the core driving factor of human behavior, where you're a desirous creature, and that desire comes from this self-preservation, I'll call it an instinct, if not the right term, self-preservation striving. There's nothing that's inherently rational about it, however. Like, people can strive for the most irrational things, they can desire the most irrational things. We're not guided necessarily toward what actually preserves us. Part of why this book is called Ethics is that he believes that knowing the truth will guide us, however, in a manner that does enable us to endure. And I'll hopefully get to that in a few minutes. From desire, from this core affect of desire, come our value judgments. And it's based on desire that we believe the things we do. Some classical thinkers, like of the Socratic tradition, thought that people were necessarily determined to do the good. They thought that was like human's natural telos, man's natural end was to do the good or to follow the good. Spinoza flips that on its head, and this is quote number 5. It's clear that we neither strive for, nor will, nor desire anything because we judge it to be good. On the contrary, we judge something to be good because we strive for it, will it, want it, and desire it. So, this, he didn't have a notion of the unconscious per se, but I think maybe we can think about it in those terms. We want certain things, we will certain things, and as a result of those desires, we come to view things as good and bad. So it's not those value judgments that move our actions, it's the other way around. George.
So it seems like he believes there are the ascetic life.
Yes.
And so does his philosophy express this as an idea?
Yeah, interesting. So I would say, in part, I would say that he views the contemplative life as the best life. And he doesn't view material things as being particularly of enduring value. However, he wouldn't necessarily advocate being a hermit, living on a mountainside, getting rid of all your possessions. He understands that taking care of your body, taking care of your needs is a part of life. And he advocates in the book, it's sort of in one sentence, but doing things like listening to music or going to the theater or doing things that make life enjoyable is part of a good life. You shouldn't be living in isolation, just thinking all the time. But the endless search for material and bodily pleasures is not going to grant you satisfaction. It's from this ultimate, from this desire, from this will, that we have our value judgments, that we have our beliefs. So beliefs, superstitious beliefs, myths, can't so easily be cleared away. It's not a simple process of education where I was misinformed, but now I heard what was reality, so now I can get rid of my previously false beliefs, because your beliefs really come from this inner striving. And what ultimately leads to your behavior is, in Spinoza's mind, a sort of battle, a sort of conflict, if you will, between sort of your passions and your more reasonable affects, and your more reasonable driving. And there's sort of like an endless conflict with one another. And it's always possible for the passions to overwhelm our reason, and it's possible for the reasons to gain control over the passions. And what Spinoza wants to do, at least in part, is make the reasonable affects, your reasonable drive, stronger, so that you can dissect your passions. You can understand why you feel passionate the way you do, and ultimately subdue those passions. Passions get in the way. To go back to your question, there's never a value to the passions in general interfere with the rational mind. So I wouldn't call it ascetic necessarily, but it's a very intellectual mindset.
You use the phrase rational affect.
Mm-hmm.
So how's it, if they're all affects and they're all material, how do you distinguish between them or discriminate between them? And it's like,
so the irrational affect, a rational view of the world, is true. Spinoza is unapologetic about having a notion of true and false in the world, and the human mind, as I was saying earlier, is at least capable of a certain kind of harmony with the world. And so, if you're thinking about things in this causal manner and understanding, even if you have certain passions, but why you feel that way and what's driving them, and I was robbed today, so therefore I'm feeling upset at the world. You can sort of undo the power of those passions, I would say. So not only understanding the outside world in this causal way, but understanding your own mind and your own emotions through these purely naturalistic causes, even though that might not be the beliefs or the emotions that you want to have in a certain sense at that moment. You might have anger or love or whatever it is, but understanding why you feel the way you do.
It's not really an affect, or is it not? It's an executive function, or it's a.
He would call it an affect, but I think that for Spinoza, you're always, in some sense, embodied, let's call it that, by an affect. That could take a more passionate form, or it could take a more rational form. Question in the back?
So understand where there's morality and being rational. They're both natural courses of the nature of the world. The rational example, of course, is to have passions. There's no moral difference between them.
Oh, agreed. Yeah, absolutely no moral difference at all. And he would say, in a quote we'll get to in a few minutes, like, you can, by equal right of nature, pursue rational things and the most barbaric things, and there's no moral way to differentiate between those things.
Why does he recommend a life of introspection versus a life of chasing passion?
Yeah, so it's a pragmatic argument. He part of it is an instrumental argument that you can accomplish more, you can live a better life if you're living according to reason than if you're living according to the passions. The part of it, and this is sort of a very quirky part of Spinoza's philosophy, is that for Spinoza, we have this drive to self-preservation, and we think of that being living longer. Our bodies, of course, are going to pass away at some point, but our mind, insofar as our mind is capable of thinking rational truths about the universe that are logical and sort of essential truths, insofar as the mind has those thoughts, the mind is embodying eternity in a certain sense, because these are things that are eternally true about the universe. And so this is the only true and ultimate self-preservation that a human being can achieve in one's lifetime, is to have these rational truths, because these things will always be true. Now this part of Spinoza's philosophy is probably the most contentious part of his philosophy, whether it can be accepted, whether it's meaningful in any sense to say that my fleeting thought and somehow allows me to embody eternity. But he felt that just as these facts, these truths are part of the timeless essence of God, that's our only taste of eternity.
Some of the angles of a triangle is 180 degrees, like that.
Yeah,
that kind of thing.
Exactly right. Great example. Yeah.
That's eternity.
Yes, because
It will always be true.
It will always be true. It's any kind of logical fact like that. It's like, but I think Spinoza could even say, like, this book is black, even though this book won't be around for eternity. But at this brief moment in time, that was a true statement. that probably gets into color theory, which is a bad example. But yes, it's the logical truth that is always true. Yes, please.
Apropos your comments about the mind that lives on after the body, how would you connect Spinoza's philosophy with the traditional Jewish thought of his time and before? Do you see connections there?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So there had been a rationalist tradition of Jewish thought. I mean, Maimonides is the most famous example, of course, but there's some others like Gersonides or Hasdai Crescus, and they're trying to understand the world in rational ways while at the same time being tied to the core of Jewish thinking. Maybe they stretch what that means to be a traditional Jew, and they're sometimes attacked for that, but they're still, at least today, considered orthodox. But Spinoza, in some ways, is a successor of that tradition, and in some ways he carries their thought to a logical extreme, and he is very willing to drop any religious elements that no longer fit the rationalist conception, which the previous thinkers would have felt at least a certain core. I mean, Maimonides says at one point that the world could be created and the world may be eternal, which is what Aristotle says, and we really don't have a way to determine that, but since the Torah says that the world was created, we should believe that the world was created. Spinoza would never say, well, that's a good reason to believe in something. So he's reading those people, and I think he's taking their thought to an extreme. And maybe at the end of the talk I can get back to sort of where he falls in that tradition of Jewish philosophy and after him as well. How are we doing on time now? Yeah, it's 8:50. Okay. Let me take a few minutes to talk about this book, the Theological Political Treatise. So, on the one hand, this is one of the foundational books of the liberal democratic tradition. As I mentioned, Jefferson and Adams and Franklin all own this book. He makes strong arguments for freedom, especially free speech, and for democracy as the best form of government. This is decades before John Locke, who's probably considered more famously a founder of liberal democracy. At the same time, it's also one of the fiercest attacks on the Bible that the world had ever seen and maybe has ever seen. Unlike some of the atheists of our own day, he is extremely well steeped in the religious literature of his day. He knows the whole Tanakh as well as Christian Bible backward and forward. He's engaging with the Bavli, the Rashi, with Ibn Ezra, Rambam. So he knows their philosophy, he knows their grammar, he's arguing with them on all these levels. And he makes some very strong arguments, and because he's so knowledgeable, it's not easy to dismiss. And as an aside, I think today we have a peaceful coexistence between liberal thought and religious thought. We like to be tolerant of one another and think these two things can coexist. The founders of this tradition were not so much of the belief that one can maintain traditional religion and also be a liberal Democrat. Certainly Spinoza is a good example. Hobbes and Rousseau argue very much against the Bible and traditional religious beliefs. Some people like Locke are a little bit more politic in what they say, but I think at their core we're not such believers in their compatibility. But that's an aside. What's interesting is, much like in the Ethics, he maintains a veneer, at least, of religiosity throughout the book. He maintains this very pious attitude. He says he's trying to recover the true meaning of the Bible. He's saying, let's forget how the theological tradition has passed down to us. The Bible's been distorted. I'm bringing back the true meaning of the Bible. And because he knows it so well, he's always able to bring back a quote, whether it's Hebrew Bible or New Testament, to back up his beliefs. I don't have time to go deeply into it, but like I said, he attacks prophecy, revelation, miracles. He attacks traditional authorship of the Bible, not only the divinity of the Torah, but also the belief that certain people like Joshua or Solomon wrote the books that we attribute to them. He's dating these books much later to Ezra and to later thinkers, which for his day was quite radical, but many of these beliefs have been accepted, and many people think that Ezra wrote at least the proto-form of the books we have today. He also attacks any notion of morality that's either divine or natural. This goes back to your question. So we can turn here to 6 on the source sheet here. This is his notion of natural right, meaning what's right by nature, what's right and wrong by nature. By natural right, I merely mean the rules of the nature of each individual, in accordance with which we conceive each as naturally determined for existing and operating in a certain mode. For instance, fish are naturally determined for swimming, and the greater for devouring the smaller. Therefore, fish take possession of the water, and the greater devour the smaller by natural right. For it's certain that nature has right to do anything. In other words, her right is coextensive with her power. The power of nature is the power of God, which is right over all things, and inasmuch as the power of nature is simply the aggregate of all the powers of all her individual components, it follows that every individual has sovereign right to do all that he can. In other words, the right of an individual extends to the utmost limit of his power, as it has been conditioned. We do not here acknowledge any difference between mankind and other natural entities, nor between men endowed with reason and to those whom reason is unknown, nor between fools, madmen, and sane men. Whatever an individual does by the laws of nature, it has a sovereign right to do, as it cannot act otherwise. And here's a biblical quote. This is identical to the teaching of Paul, who teaches that there is no sin before there is law, which obviously this is not at all what Paul has to say, but he always has a quote to defend his own belief. Whatsoever, therefore, an individual thinks useful for himself, whether led by sound reason or impelled by the passions, he has a sovereign right to seek and take for himself the best he can, whether by force, cunning, entreaty, or any other means. Consequently, he may regard as an enemy anyone who hinders the accomplishment of this purpose. So there's absolutely no natural or divine grounding for morality. This might sound like a philosophy of anarchy or of despotism. He doesn't advocate for that at all. He is advocating for democracy, but he's arguing for democracy in purely pragmatic terms. And what you might say is that he is absolutizing politics. All of our beliefs of right and wrong are purely within the political sphere. There's no way to invoke any true laws of what's right and wrong and say this is not what God would want. He said, no. If you want to live in a just society, you have to put just people in charge who are going to create the kind of world that you want to live in. And you can't evoke anything else. People can do whatever they want to do. Similarly, there's no purpose, no arc of history for Spinoza. We're not headed in an enlightenment direction. We're not headed toward a more just future. I'd be remiss to mention that in this context, Spinoza is sometimes called the first Zionist. And if you look at note 7, you can see why here. He said, I would go so far as to believe that if the foundation of the Jewish religion have not emasculated their minds, they will someday, given the occasion, as human affairs are changeable, erect their imperium once more. So the Jews have not been forsaken by God. They have simply lost their kingdom of Israel because they were disempowered. And if the Jews one day become empowered again, the Jews can return to Israel. And it's purely a question of power. It's not a question of God's will or anything like that. A few hundred years early, but a very interesting quote. I know that we're running low on time here, so let me just stop talking about his work. I'll say a few minutes about his influence. So as I said earlier, for about 100 years his name is associated with evil, with atheism. No one can really quote Spinoza in their own name. This changes in the late 1700s. Kant, the German philosopher, is the first to really bring Spinoza to the surface. Not in a positive way. He sees really there's only being two philosophies, one being Spinoza's philosophy, the other being his own. And he's saying, if you don't adopt my philosophy, Kant's philosophy, we are stuck with Spinoza's philosophy, which you don't want any more than I do. It's naturalistic and deterministic, and there's no room for morality. And Kant makes a very complicated argument for how we avoid this notion of causal nature by basically saying it's complicated. We basically recreate the mind, create the world in our own minds. I may not go down that path. Some later philosophers, however, do see Spinoza as actually the correct first step, and we just have to finish his thoughts. So Hegel and Nietzsche and Marx actually see Spinoza as a kind of precursor, and he, in some sense, was correct about this. We just have to finish his philosophy. In terms of Jewish philosophy, as I mentioned earlier, there is this rationalist tradition that starts with Maimonides, or maybe even side you're going, arguably. I think that tradition comes to an end with Spinoza. There's really no more tolerance for where philosophy can go, and people begin to see philosophy or free thinking as inherently antithetical to Judaism. And I think you could argue that there's, for at least a few hundred years to the 20th century, no one who you would say was an important rabbinical scholar, Talmud Chacham, who's also an important philosopher. I would not put Moritz Mendelssohn in that category of either. I really think it's in the 20th century when you have sort of the breakdown of Enlightenment philosophy that you begin to find a resurfacing of Jewish thought in the Rav or in other people. Insofar as he contributed to the Enlightenment, he did have an important impact on Jews. He led to a world that's much more tolerant of religious diversity and of religious freedom as well as free speech. So he played a role in the free lives that we live. It's hard to say that he had a true impact on the Zionist movement, but Ben-Gurion was a big reader of Spinoza and a big advocate of Spinoza, and this will be the final quote in our pamphlet here. This is from 1953, Jewish Telegraphic Agency. Ben-Gurion demands abolition of 300-year ban on Spinoza. The abolition of the excommunication declared by the Amsterdam Jewish community about 300 years ago by the philosopher Baruch Spinoza, and the publication of all his works is demanded by David Ben-Gurion, retired Israel premier, in his first article written, Sde Boker, Residence in the Negev. The article is published in Devar, a pro-government labor-right daily newspaper. Ben-Gurion urged that his publication of Spinoza's works would be timed for the 300th anniversary of the excommunication, 1656. And there are still today some people who try to make this happen, who try to advocate us for undoing this cherem and bringing him back into the fold. Whether that's appropriate or not, I'll let others judge. So let me pause there. It's almost 9 o'clock, and see what questions you might have.
Another name when you could tell the relationship, Einstein. Is Einstein influenced by Spinoza? I mean, it's always my impression.
Yeah, so Einstein, I think he'd asked in one interview, do you believe in God? And he said, I believe in Spinoza's God. The God of that can be explained via nature's laws. Einstein does write a poem about Spinoza, an interesting poem that, as I read it, in some ways it's critical of Spinoza, but it's at the same time sympathetic of his motivations and of his desire to understand the world and to not be tied to beliefs about the world, superstitions, and to be a free thinker, an innovative thinker. I can't believe Spinoza had much impact on the content of Einstein's thought, probably not, but I think he saw him as a sympathetic figure in terms of breaking from the past.
You said before that you didn't believe that there was any natural law or natural reason for morality, but the quote from on number 6 seems to suggest that he felt that natural law was that might make right.
Yeah, so in a certain sense, yeah, I mean, he collapses. Normally, right by definition is something that is separate from might, because a right is something that should protect you from the power of others in some sense. That you have a right to, whether it's to speak or just to act or be free from some interference in some way. And if you say that might equals right, it's sort of a way of saying that there's no right at all, because anyone who has power over you has the quote-unquote right to do what he or she wants to you. So I think it's a polite way or a roundabout way of saying there is no right, is only power.
But then wouldn't like a political system that contravenes that right be untrue or against the plan?
Well, they couldn't, because if a government has power over you, then they have right, you could say, over you. And if you want to overthrow the government and are successful at that, then that's your right equally as well. So there's really no way to make a value judgment for anything being wrong in any sense, because whatever has happened, first of all, could only have happened that way, and second of all, is an embodiment of the powers of those two things. So, just as two atoms, you might say, might balance against each other, multiple human beings can have an interaction, and what the outcome is of that engagement is purely a function of the deterministic laws of the universe and the power relations of those items or people or objects.
All right, I think we'll pause here for this evening. Thank you very, very much. Next week, this series concludes with Paul of Tarsus. Thank you.
Thank you.